In many ways, the relationship between social connectedness and health is kind of an intuitive one. We all know that we feel better when we talk to friends, when we're gathered together. But maybe you've spent less time just thinking about how social connectedness really impacts not just your emotional health, but your physical health. Or you've kind of taken your relationships in your life for granted, and you've spent less time thinking about how to really build connections within communities. And that's what we're going to be focusing on as we talk today. So this morning I'm going to focus on trying to answer 3 questions to give us all a common foundation to have as we have some conversations after lunch around social connectedness and things that you're doing in your communities and challenges that you're running into. And I'll just focus on trying to address kind of 3 broad topics. The first is just how does social connectedness influence health? And I'll be talking a bit then about what we know about social connectedness within our state, and then talk a bit about what we know we can do to increase social connectedness within communities. So first, what is social connectedness? Well, there are a lot of terms and concepts that can be used to describe the relationships that we have with one another. Social connectedness, social capital, social integration, and all of these things kind of fall under one broad definition that I'll be using today, which is just simply that social connectedness is the extent to which people interact with one another, both individually and through groups. And through these interactions, we're talking about relationships where there's some kind of reciprocity or some exchange between people. So it might be an exchange of trust, of ideas, of intimacy, of different kinds of resources, but some kind of exchange that people really value. And when we talk about social connectedness or social capital, we can talk about it generally on 3 different levels: bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. And I'll just take a couple minutes to describe what those different levels are. So if I think about my social network, the bonding social capital that I have in my life comes from the relationships that I have with my close friends and family members, the people that I grew up with, my spouse, my other close friends and family. And through those relationships, there's a lot of intimacy, there's a lot of trust. Those relationships are very inward-looking, and they offer a great deal of influence on how we live our lives. They're very nurturing, and can also be a little exclusionary to those outside of the group. Bridging social capital is kind of that next level. It's the relationships that I have with people in my book club and my colleagues at work, the people who live in my neighborhood. And there's probably a lot of similarities that I have with these people, but we have different background experiences, we have different values. I learn things from these individuals about other resources that I may not be familiar. They can introduce a new perspective on issues for me. And so these types of relationships are really important in developing access to new kinds of resources or information. And a third kind of social capital is linking social capital. And you can think of these as being the networks that people have with one another when there are very different levels of power. So it might be the relationship that I have with a legislator or a city council member, somebody who's making decisions on my behalf but that I don't have a necessarily close relationship with. Now there are a couple things to keep in mind when we're thinking about our networks. First of all, our networks aren't measured just by the number of connections that we have, it's the quality of these relationships. And some of these connections may be stronger than others, some may be positive, some may be negative. And we can try to measure the quality of these relationships in a lot of different ways. We can think about the number of connections that we have, but we can think about the amount of trust that's there. We can think about how often you're involved in maintaining these relationships, whether or not the relationship offers a positive influence on our lives. And when we think about having a social network, there isn't some magical number that suddenly means, yes, now we're connected. It's really about how we perceive the strength of these networks and how well these networks serve us in being able to have a lot of social support in our lives and helping us access other resources. So how do these connections then influence our health? Well, first I'll focus on how these relationships influence our health indirectly by influencing our behaviors, our beliefs, our knowledge, our values. I think first of all, we all know we talk about health all the time. You might have talked to a relative the other day about some health symptoms that they're experiencing and you offered some advice. Or maybe you had a conversation over lunch earlier this week about changes in your child's school lunch program and whether or not they're enjoying having more fruits and vegetables on their plate. And we give each other kind of informal advice when we have a recommendation about a chiropractor that we went to. So we're constantly exchanging different kinds of health information and kind of helping one another increase our knowledge. The people around us, though, also increase or create some social norms around our health. You know, I grew up in a family where we were all really physically active. I remember playing basketball with my dad, went on walks with my mom. You know, my brother and sister and I, we were always outside and playing. And I think, you know, when I step back, I think about how that's influenced my life now and how I bring those values forward and how we think about raising our daughter and that physical activity is important. We can also think about the relationship between social connectedness and health when we think about what happens when those connections aren't there, when people are socially isolated. And studies have shown that there's a relationship between isolation and poor physical health. Feelings of isolation have been associated with higher rates of health conditions like cancer, high blood pressure, and diabetes. And in addition, in national studies, people who report that they're more isolated are more likely to rate their health as fair or poor, as opposed to excellent or good. So conversely, studies have shown that people who have stronger connections have lower blood pressure, they tend to have better health outcomes following surgery and other major illnesses, and other benefits in their health. So how does this happen? How do these relationships actually influence our physical health? Well, there are a number of ways that strong connections influence our body's physiology, but I'll just focus on one, and that's the impact of stress. I think we all know that stress can negatively influence our life in a number of ways. And again, through studies, we know that people with lower levels of connectedness tend to have higher levels of cortisol and stress hormones. So people experiencing high levels of stress may overlook symptoms of health conditions like their heart racing and delay seeking health care services. They may be less likely to take medications as recommended. They might increase their amount of tobacco use, eat less healthy foods, exercise less regularly, or drink more alcohol. We also know that stress impacts our sleep. And I think we're probably all a little too familiar with what happens when our sleep is disrupted. There are all types of changes in our emotional stability, you know, our physical health, our body's physiology. For instance, there's been research showing that wounds don't heal as quickly when our bodies are under a lot of stress. So even though there are a lot of benefits associated with social connectedness, it's also important to point out that not every relationship is a good one, and that some can actually have a negative influence on our health. So as I mentioned, the way that we are raised and the people that we associate with can have a huge influence on our health, and that can be positive or negative. For instance, you know, it's harder for me maybe to order a salad at lunch if all of my coworkers want to order pizza. And I may not value exercise as much if I grew up in a family where that wasn't part of our daily life. There are also examples of groups where there's high levels of bonding, high levels of trust, but where there's a lot of negative results. Youth gangs are a great example of that. And also there are studies that show that people who have close relationships with friends and family, but who serve in a caregiving role, may be experiencing higher levels of stress because they don't have external support outside of their friends and family, and there's a lot of pressure on their lives. And I'll be talking more about that in just a couple minutes. I'll give you just another diagram of how all of this ties together. This is from the Framingham Heart Study, and it's a diagram of how people are connected with one another through their family relations, that's through friends, through relationships with coworkers. And the green circles here represent people who have normal BMIs. And the yellow circles are people who are overweight or obese. And as we look a little bit closer, what you can start to see is through these connections, there are people where all the connections include green circles, people that have a normal BMI. And there are clusters of people that are overweight or obese. Now, does this mean that obesity is contagious? Certainly not. Don't quote me as saying that. That's not the point. But it does suggest that those relationships maybe are supporting healthy or unhealthy behaviors in some kind of way, and that the network can be potentially helpful or harmful to health. So as I mentioned, there are lots of different ways to measure social connectedness, and it poses some problems, I think, as we're trying to understand this in our state and in our communities. There are many different ways that we describe social connectedness, and that can cause some problems. And there are many different ways to measure it. We might look at, again, the number of close friends we have, the frequency of interactions, the levels of trust. We might look at our networks and look at the diversity of people that we know within our networks and how similar or dissimilar we are, or the perceived quality of relationships. But really the only way to get at that information is from asking people individually through a community survey or some pretty in-depth interviewing, and that information isn't always readily available. But there are some measures that we can look to get a better sense of social connectedness within our state and within our regions. And I'll just highlight a couple of these. Volunteerism is often used as a measure of social connectedness. And we know that in our state, about 4 in 10 Minnesotans age 16 or older have volunteered in the last year. And that puts us second among states in the United States. And actually, among adults 65 or older, we're first among the nation in terms of rates of volunteerism. But although volunteerism, is high overall, there are differences between groups of residents. So in general, women tend to volunteer more than men. And in addition, we see that white residents tend to volunteer more than residents of color. Now, there are a couple things that might explain this. One is that volunteer rates tend to be higher among older residents, and we certainly have a population that is more likely to be white as they're older. Also, this measure of volunteerism doesn't necessarily capture everything that people do to help one another. And so in close-knit communities where there's a lot of informal support that's being offered, raking leaves for someone else, taking a friend or family member to the doctor, all of those things that we just kind of naturally do to help one another, those aren't necessarily captured in those measures. So we'll talk a little bit more about this and what this might mean in terms of building, bridging, and bonding social capital within communities of color. We can also think about how youth are connected within our communities. So involvement in after-school activities, sports, community activities, is a way that youth not only learn new skills, but they meet new peers, and peers that may be a little less similar to themselves, and so they're developing that bridging social capital. They meet coaches and other adults and have other caregivers in their life. Overall, about 2/3 of students are highly engaged in enrichment activities, and that means that they're involved in something 3 or more times a week. But we see that there's differences by income. About 70% of higher income students are involved in activities 3 or more times a week, compared to only 54% of lower income students. And one implication from this is that we do need to be really thoughtful about how many activities are free or low cost and how we're making those opportunities available to all youth. But I also want to make sure that you're not taking away that I'm implying that lower income students and youth aren't as connected, because certainly they can have really high levels of bonding social capital within their friends and families. They might have great relationships within their neighborhoods, but it does mean that maybe they're missing out on some opportunities to get to know some people that are less similar to themselves, or that they may not necessarily meet just by the time that they spend in their neighborhoods or in other kinds of activities outside of these school and community activities. So what do these things highlight? I think first of all, these data show that in Minnesota, we are involved in our communities, and more so than in other places in the nation. And that we're certainly trying to find ways to support youth in our communities and find ways to support them. But that said, we do see differences in social connectedness. And because we know that there is a relationship between social connectedness and health, this is one thing for us to be thinking about in terms of ways that we can work together to reduce health disparities that are so persistent in our state. So there's so much that we could really talk about today, and I kind of struggled to think about just 3 small places to be able to focus some of our these last few comments. So I'm going to try to focus on answering just kind of 3 questions related to social connectedness, and these kind of relate to issues that are reflective to the changes in our demographics within our state. So the first is, how can communities of color capitalize on strong family relationships so that there can be more opportunities for bridging and linking social capital? The second is what works in building social capital among older adults, and then I'll talk briefly about how we even think about social capital in this digital age. So in general, residents of color tend to have higher levels of bonding social capital than white residents. And those are those relationships with the most tight-knit circle of friends and family members. And these relationships are an incredibly important asset. They offer a lot of emotional support. However, residents of color tend to have lower levels of bridging social capital, meaning they don't have the relationships with people outside of their intimate group of friends and family. Well, why is that important? I mean, I think first of all, when we think about these bridging relationships, sometimes those are the relationships that give us kind of those inroads. You know, we find out about the job that hasn't been posted yet. We find out about other resources available in our community. And so there's kind of a missed opportunity to share knowledge. Also, we can think about the relationships that are outside of our closest group of friends as giving us additional emotional support. One study I reviewed looked at levels of bonding social capital and stress and symptoms of depression for different cultures. And this study found that African American women had the highest levels of bonding social capital, but also had the highest rates of stress. Well, why is that the case? Well, often these women are caregivers for their children, but also the main source of support for their aunts, their uncles, their parents, all of these different people, and they didn't have the emotional support that they needed outside of that intimate group of friends to help them keep their stress levels down. Now, this issue around caregiving isn't just related to communities of color. In a recent study done by some of my colleagues, they found that about a third of caregivers interviewed in St. Paul had low levels of informal support, and that those caregivers were more likely to report that they were in fair or poor health. It's also really important to note that racism and discrimination can be thought of as that break in bridging social capital within communities. And we certainly know that racism plays an important factor in our overall health. And I just want to point out that even though generally communities of color tend to have higher levels of bonding social capital, there's a high potential for isolation for residents, particularly new immigrant and refugees, who, when they don't have those close levels of connections with friends and family, can be incredibly isolated. And language barriers and other issues can really serve as a large barrier to be able to build those bridging connections. So what can be done in terms of increasing bridging and linking social capital in communities of color? One is to work closely with communities in color to invest in natural hubs or convening spaces, or making those places not just places to meet, but places where community resources can be available. That's one strategy that's being used in the Promise neighborhood here in our neighborhood. Also, I think we can't overlook the need to address some of the underlying factors that contribute to differences in opportunities for connectedness, such as economic and educational opportunities. And it's really important to think about ways to engage residents of color in different decision-making processes. Using things like health impact assessments can be a way to engage residents more deliberately in those kinds of efforts. I'm going to switch gears just to talk about implications for social connectedness with older adults in our state. I think we all know that there's a major demographic shift happening in our state, kind of the graying of Minnesota, as our baby boomers face retirement. And Jane will be talking more about the implications of this a little bit later on. But what we do know is that social isolation among older adults tends to be higher. And that happens because for a number of factors, but some key ones just being the huge number of life-changing events that happens as we age. As we retire, we lose connections with the colleagues that we've been working with for years. We lose a spouse, other loved ones. There are changes in our physical mobility, so it's harder to go outside into the community and just be involved in other activities. There are changes in our living situation, so we're no longer around the neighbors that we were for much of our lives, perhaps. And the existing networks that older residents have can be an incredibly important resource, but there's often a need to build new relationships as people age. So what works then in terms of building connections for older residents? Well, targeted group interventions are really important, and focusing on things that aren't just an opportunity to get together and socialize, but that maybe have an educational aspect, maybe something that's focused on health, something that really draws people together into the room. Also, it's really important to note that for older residents, they find a lot of value in relationships where there's reciprocity. So home visiting is a strategy that's often used to provide services to older adults, but that approach can really be enhanced when it isn't just a one-way relationship and there are opportunities for that older resident to really be able to give back in that relationship. We also know that because volunteering rates are so high among this age group, that engaging older adults as mentors and as volunteers can be another way to increase social connectedness for this population. And it's just important to keep in mind that as different types of interventions are considered, that adaptations are kept in mind to make sure that all adults are able to participate. And that may mean making some accommodations for changes in the physical needs of residents, their mobility or vision or hearing, or changes in memory, and so providing information in different kinds of ways. Now I'll talk just a little bit about what social connectedness maybe means in this digital age, as we're encouraged to tweet and also encouraged to communicate with one another around our tables. You know, if you've read Bowling Alone, you know that a key premise of that book is that we're becoming less involved in our communities, and that we are involved in fewer social groups, and we have fewer connections, and there's less trust within our neighbors. And that impacts the relationships that we have. And at the same time, there are these growing opportunities to be able to connect with people in ways that we never imagined. You know, I can go online and find groups of people that I'm really interested in learning more about, and they may live all across the country and all across the world. So how do we define community in this digital age? And what then do we try to do to build social connectedness? Well, when we think about the impact of social media, there's kind of two schools of thought. One is that social media is becoming a replacement for face-to-face relationships. We spend too much time focused on our computers and on our phones, and we're forgetting the people around us, and we're not investing the time into the personal face-to-face relationships that we need. Another school of thought is that there's more of a positive impact, that really social media is enhancing the relationships that we have, and it's working in parallel to increase the frequency of contact that we have with individuals, and not becoming a replacement for that. And actually, when we look at the research, some of the initial research around social media was more focused on some of the negative impacts, and that was kind of in this early stage when there were a lot more anonymous chat rooms and things like that. And now we're starting to see more research that talks about more of the positive impacts of social media. Now, that isn't to say that social media isn't without faults. I mean, I think, unfortunately, we've all heard too many examples of how it can be a very exclusionary kind of world. We've heard a lot about cyberbullying and things like that that are happening. There's also differences in how people use social media and how that makes us feel in terms of isolation. There is an article in the Atlantic, not that long ago, that looked at different types of Facebook users. And among people who use Facebook the most, there is a group that was highly engaged in Facebook, and they're posting things and commenting things. And those people felt very, very connected. And some other groups of people who spend a similar amount of time on Facebook, but are just kind of looking at what other people are doing, ended up feeling much more isolated. So we can all use Facebook. We may not all use it well. Regardless of how you feel about the impact of social media, internet use is definitely rising. Almost all young adults use internet now, 97% in 2012. Among adults 65 or older, internet use has increased from 14% in 2000 to 53% in 2012. This is the first year that over half of older adults are using the internet. And we can see similar trends when we look at social networking use. Now, over 80% of young adults use social networking sites, and while this has kind of plateaued over the last few years, use is increasing among other age groups. And can you believe it's only 7 years ago that less than 10% of us were using Facebook and other sites like that? So given that social networking, social media is here, how do we use this as an asset as we think about building social connectedness? Well, one is making sure that through interventions and projects that you're planning, that you're thinking of social media as an enhancement of and not a replacement for the face-to-face relationships that people have. So it might be a way to increase the quantity of contacts that people have with one another, but not necessarily a way to just meet new people. Often there has to be some kind of face-to-face opportunities as well to keep that relationship going. Also, people find more value when they know more than just somebody's screen name through internet sites, and so there has to be a way to increase some personal connections and that people just aren't posting things anonymously. And also, you know, just to be thoughtful and thinking about the technical and training resources that people may need. So I guess if I had to leave you with 3 things, I'd want you to remember that, first of all, relationships do matter, and they matter not only to our emotional but our physical health. And that improving social connectedness may be one way, you know, maybe not the silver bullet, but one way that we can reduce health disparities in our state. And finally, that no single activity is we'll work in every community to increase social connectedness. You know, after we have lunch, you'll be introduced to a number of Connect for Health grantees and others that applied and are working in social connectedness and in their communities, and you'll have opportunities to talk with one another about what you're doing. And it's important to think, and so in thinking about the right strategy for your community, it's important to think about the strengths and challenges within your community, including who is isolated and why, and then to think about developing a really diverse set of approaches that don't exclude others based on race, ability, culture, or economic status.